You climb for hours to a lake sitting in a bowl of rock above the tree line. There is no stream running in. There is no stream running out. The nearest river with fish in it is thousands of feet below. Down a slope no fish could climb. And there are trout in the water. The explanation people usually reach for involves birds carrying eggs on their feet. And that explanation is almost certainly wrong. The real answer, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is considerably less romantic and considerably more interesting. Somebody put them there, frequently by dropping them out of an aeroplane. Let's dig into this properly, because the starting point is a fact that surprises almost everyone. Most high mountain lakes were naturally fishless. Not depleted, not damaged. Fishless from the beginning, and for straightforward reasons. Lakes sitting above waterfalls, above steep cascades, or in basins carved by glaciers and sealed off by rock have no route by which a fish could arrive. Fish cannot cross land, cannot climb waterfalls beyond a certain height, and cannot appear in isolated water without some mechanism delivering them. Surveys of alpine lake systems and mountain ranges across western North America, in the Alps, in the Pyrenees, and elsewhere have consistently found that a substantial majority of high-elevation lakes held no fish before human intervention. In some regions, the figure exceeds 90%. That establishes the baseline. Any trout in a lake above the tree line requires an explanation, and there are several in very different proportions. Let's talk about the dominant one too, because the scale of it is truly difficult to picture. Deliberate stocking of mountain lakes has been carried out on an enormous scale for well over a century, and it continues in many places today. The early efforts were done by hand. Fish were carried up in milk cans, buckets, and pack containers on horses and mules, and by people on foot in operations that required keeping the fish alive during a climb of hours. Records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe considerable effort expended on exactly this. Driven by demand for recreational angling and by an attitude toward wilderness that regarded an empty lake as a resource being wasted. Then came aircraft. From the middle of the 20th century, fisheries agencies in several American states began stocking lakes by air, flying over a lake and releasing young fish from a low altitude. It sounds implausible, and it works. The fish are small, a few inches at most, and they fall a modest distance into water, with survival rates reported as high by the agencies conducting it, because a small fish falling into a lake experiences far less force than intuition suggests, given its low mass and terminal velocity. Aerial stocking allowed lakes to be reached that would have taken days on foot, and it multiplied the number of lakes stocked enormously. Programs in states including Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, and California have distributed very large numbers of fish this way over decades, and comparable operations have been conducted elsewhere. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes the whole question. When someone finds trout in a remote alpine lake and wonders how nature managed it, the answer is usually that nature did not. A government agency did, on a schedule, and possibly from an aircraft. Let's talk about the natural routes too, because they are real and they account for the lakes that really did have fish. The most important is simple connectivity, past or present. A lake with an inlet or outlet stream connecting downstream to a fish-bearing river can be colonized, provided nothing along that route is impassable. Fish move upstream readily, and trout in particular are capable of ascending steep gradients and leaping obstacles up to a certain height. Many lakes that appear isolated have or had a connection that a determined fish could negotiate. Glacial history matters enormously here. During and after glaciation, drainage patterns were completely different from today. Meltwater lakes formed, drained, and connected basins that are now separate. Ice dams created temporary waterways and then failed catastrophically, and outburst floods of enormous scale reorganized entire drainage systems. A lake isolated now may have been connected to a river network 10,000 years ago, and the fish population present today may descend from colonists who arrived when the landscape was arranged differently. Stream capture provides another route over longer timescales. Erosion gradually shifts drainage divides, and a headwater stream cutting backwards can intercept a stream from an adjacent basin, redirecting its flow and connecting two previously separate systems. That process operates over geological time and has certainly moved fish between drainages. Extreme floods do the same thing suddenly. A sufficiently large event can overtop a divide, connect basins temporarily, and transfer fish before subsiding. Beavers, remarkably, contribute as well, since dam construction raises water levels and can create passable routes where none existed. Let's talk about the fish that were always there too, because some mountain waters do hold native populations and their histories are instructive. Post-glacial colonization is the main mechanism. As ice sheets retreated across northern latitudes, enormous quantities of meltwater created temporary lakes and drainage connections that no longer exist, and fish moved through those routes into newly available habitat. Species tolerant of cold water were best positioned, which is why char, whitefish, and various salmonids dominate the native fish of northern lakes. Some of those populations then became isolated when the connections closed, and they have been evolving separately ever since. That produces a phenomenon of considerable interest to biologists: repeated independent evolution of similar forms in separate lakes. Char populations in different lakes across northern Europe and North America have repeatedly split into distinct forms specializing in different depths and food sources, with differences in body shape, size, and coloration. And genetic work indicates these divergences happened separately in each lake, rather than being inherited from a common ancestor that was already split. Some isolated populations are entirely unique, found in one lake and nowhere else, which makes them both scientifically valuable and extremely vulnerable. Introducing another species into such a lake can eliminate something that exists in a single place on Earth, and several such losses are documented. There is also a category of relict populations left behind when climate changed. Fish adapted to cold water that colonized widely during glacial periods survive now only in isolated cold refuges. Deep lakes, spring-fed systems, high elevations, while the warmer waters between those refuges became uninhabitable for them. Those populations are effectively stranded, and they are among the first to be affected as water temperatures rise. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. Ancient Minds Academy gives you 10 exclusive videos, over 3 hours and 30 minutes of content, diving deep into the daily life, beliefs, and struggles of early humans. Every video comes with a full PDF guide so you can explore at your own pace. Link is in the description. Or you can scan this QR code directly. Don't forget to use code ANCIENT15 for 15% off. Let's talk about the bird explanation too, because it deserves a fair examination rather than dismissal, and the evidence is thinner than its popularity suggests. The idea comes in two versions. The first holds that fish eggs stick to the feet or feathers of waterfowl and are carried between water bodies. It has been proposed since at least the 17th century and repeated ever since. The difficulty is that fish eggs of most species are not particularly adhesive once water hardened. They dry out quickly when exposed to air, and a bird flying between lakes exposes them to sustained airflow. Attempts to document the phenomenon have produced very little, and the general view among researchers is that, if it occurs at all, it is rare enough to be a minor contributor. The second version holds that eggs are eaten and survive passage through the digestive tract. This was long dismissed, and has recently been shown to be possible. A study published in 2020 fed carp eggs to mallards and recovered a very small number of intact eggs in the bird's droppings, some of which hatched. The proportion surviving was tiny, a fraction of 1%, and the finding is significant precisely because it establishes the mechanism exists rather than because it explains many populations. The honest assessment is that both routes are physically possible, that the second has now been demonstrated, and that neither accounts for more than a small share of mountain lake fish population. Species that reproduce in numbers over long timescales might colonize this way occasionally. Trout appearing in a lake that was stocked by helicopter in 1970 did not. Let's talk about everything else in the lake too, because the arrival problem applies to the entire community, and most of it solved the problem far better than fish did. Isolated alpine lakes are full of life that got there without any help. Zooplankton, aquatic insects, crustaceans, algae, and microorganisms colonize remote water bodies readily, and the mechanisms are well understood. Many small aquatic organisms produce resting stages, eggs or cysts with tough protective coatings, capable of surviving drying, freezing, and passage through a digestive tract. Those structures are microscopic, light, and produced in enormous numbers, which makes them ideal for dispersal by wind, by rain, by being carried on the feet and feathers of birds, and by being eaten and excreted. The bird transport mechanism that works poorly for fish eggs works extremely well for these. Flying insects solve it differently by flying. Mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, midges, and dragonflies all spend their larval stages in water and their adult stages in air, which means a lake sealed off from every waterway on Earth is still reachable by anything with wings. Aquatic beetles and bugs disperse the same way, flying between water bodies as adults. Amphibians walk. Frogs, toads, and salamanders move overland between breeding sites. And while their range per generation is limited, over time populations spread across landscapes in ways fish cannot. The result is that a naturally fishless alpine lake is not empty and never was. It holds a complete functioning ecosystem, assembled from organisms whose dispersal strategies suited the problem, with one conspicuous gap at the top. Introducing a large predatory fish into that arrangement drops something into an ecological role that nothing had occupied for the entire history of the lake. Let's talk about what the fish did to those lakes too, because this is where the story stops being a curiosity and becomes a conservation problem. A lake that has been fishless for its entire existence develops an ecosystem shaped by the absence of fish predation. Large-bodied zooplankton flourish because nothing is eating them. Aquatic invertebrates, including some that are conspicuous and slow-moving, persist because there is no predator selecting against being visible. And amphibians breed successfully because their tadpoles and eggs have no fish to contend with. Introducing trout into that system is not an addition, it is a reorganization. Trout eat large zooplankton preferentially, which shifts the plankton community towards smaller species, which changes algal dynamics and water clarity. They eat aquatic invertebrates heavily, and they eat amphibian eggs and larvae. The consequences for amphibians have been severe and well documented. Populations of several mountain frog and salamander species declined dramatically across ranges where stocking occurred, and research has identified introduced trout as a major driver alongside disease and other pressures. In some cases, species that were formerly abundant across a mountain range became scarce enough to warrant legal protection. Effects extend beyond the water. Amphibians and emerging aquatic insects feed terrestrial predators. And studies have found reduced abundance of some birds and other animals around lakes where fish were introduced because a food source that used to leave the lake in large quantities no longer does. Let's talk about why anyone did this too, because the motives were coherent by the standards of the time, and understanding them explains the scale. 19th century thinking about wilderness treated unproductive land as land not yet put to use. A lake without fish was an underperforming asset, and improving nature by adding useful species was regarded as straightforwardly beneficial rather than as interference. That attitude produced acclimatization societies across several continents, organizations dedicated to introducing familiar species into new places, and it is responsible for a substantial proportion of the world's invasive species problems. Recreational fishing supplied the immediate demand. As railways and later roads opened mountain regions to visitors, angling became a significant draw, and fisheries agencies responded to public pressure for fishable water. Stocking was popular, visible, and easy to justify to the people funding it. There was also a food argument in earlier periods, with stocked lakes providing a resource for miners, herders, and settlers in mountain regions where supply lines were long. What was absent was any framework for asking what the lakes already contained. Ecology as a discipline barely existed when much of this began. The invertebrate and amphibian communities of alpine lakes were essentially unstudied, and nobody was in a position to notice what was being displaced because nobody had documented what was there. That is worth stating without excessive hindsight. The people conducting these programs were not being reckless by the standards available to them. They were operating with a model of nature in which lakes were containers that could be stocked and species were resources to be distributed. The costs became visible only once the ecological research existed to measure them, by which point the introductions were many decades old. Let's talk about what is being done about it too, because the policy has shifted substantially. Recognition of these effects prompted many agencies to reduce or halt stocking in wilderness and protected areas, and in several places to remove introduced fish deliberately. Removal is done by netting, by electrofishing, and in some cases by treating a lake with a compound that affects fish specifically. It is labor-intensive, expensive, and contested, since the introduced fisheries have long-standing recreational value and constituencies who value them. Where removal has been carried out, amphibian populations have, in a number of documented cases, recovered substantially, sometimes within years, which is a reasonably strong demonstration of the causal relationship. The situation is a real conflict of legitimate interests rather than a simple case of correcting a mistake. Angling in high mountain lakes has been part of the recreational culture of these regions for over a century, generates real economic activity, and is valued by people whose connection to those landscapes is bound up with it. The ecological argument for removal is is strong, and the decision about which lakes to prioritize involves weighing that against genuine loss. Let's talk about how fish manage to live up there at all too, because alpine lakes are difficult environments. Water temperatures stay low year-round, the growing season is short, and productivity is limited because cold, nutrient-poor water supports relatively little at the base of the food chain. The result is slow growth. Trout in high lakes are frequently much smaller at a given age than the same species in richer, lower elevation waters, and populations can consist largely of stunted individuals where reproduction is successful and food is scarce. Winter is the main constraint. Ice cover cuts off gas exchange with the atmosphere, and decomposition continues under the ice-consuming oxygen, so shallow lakes can experience winter kill, oxygen falling low enough to suffocate the fish population entirely. That is a natural process, and it is why some stocked lakes require repeated restocking, since the fish cannot persist through a hard winter. Reproduction is the other constraint. Trout generally require flowing gravel-bottomed water to spawn successfully, and many lake basins provide none, meaning stocked populations cannot reproduce and exist only for as long as the introduced individuals survive. Let's talk about the same puzzle elsewhere too, because isolated water bodies of every kind raise it, and the answers vary informatively. Desert springs are the extreme case. Isolated pools in arid basins, some of them tiny, hold fish species found nowhere else, which is only explicable through past connectivity. Those regions were considerably wetter during glacial periods, holding extensive lake systems that have since evaporated, and the fish surviving in isolated springs are remnants of populations that were once continuous. Some of these species occupy a single pool and number in the hundreds, making them among the most restricted vertebrates on Earth and extremely vulnerable to groundwater extraction. Crater lakes formed by volcanic activity present a different case, since they are new water bodies with no history of connection at all. Where they contain fish, human introduction is generally the explanation, and where they do not, the reason is usually that nobody bothered. Cave systems produce their own version. Fish living in caves, frequently blind and unpigmented, descend from surface populations that entered and became isolated, and the loss of eyes and color has occurred independently in cave fish populations on multiple continents, which is one of the clearer demonstrations of how quickly unused traits degrade when no longer maintained by selection. Newly created water bodies show the process in real time. Quarry pools, reservoirs, farm ponds, and flooded gravel pits accumulate aquatic life rapidly, and studies tracking colonization find invertebrates and plants arriving within months. Fish arrive when someone brings them, or when a flood connects the pool to a stream, and rarely otherwise. The pattern that emerges across all of these is consistent. Everything smaller than a fish disperses well. Fish are the exception because they are large, require water continuously, and have no life stage capable of crossing land, which is why their presence in isolated water almost always has a specific explanation. Let's talk about what is happening to these lakes now too, because the pressures have shifted and the fish are only part of it. Warming affects alpine lakes disproportionately. High elevation and high latitude environments are experiencing temperature increases above the global average, and the consequences for a cold water lake are direct. Ice cover forms later and breaks up earlier, extending the open water season. Water temperatures rise, which reduces dissolved oxygen and stresses cold-adapted species. Glaciers feeding some lakes are retreating, altering water supply, temperature, and the sediment load arriving. For fish, this cuts both ways in an unfortunate arrangement. Longer growing seasons and warmer water can improve conditions for introduced trout in lakes that were previously marginal for them, allowing populations to persist where they previously died out over winter. Meanwhile, native cold-adapted species in lower lakes lose habitat as their thermal range contracts upward, and there is eventually nowhere further up to go. Atmospheric deposition adds another pressure that is easy to miss in remote places. Alpine lakes receive pollutants transported long distances through the atmosphere, including nitrogen compounds that fertilize water bodies adapted to extreme nutrient poverty, along with mercury and other contaminants that accumulate up food chains. Acid deposition damaged high-elevation lakes substantially in some regions during the 20th century, and recovery followed emissions controls, which is one of the clearer environmental policy successes available. Nitrogen deposition is subtler and continues. Adding nutrients to a system defined by their absence changes algal communities and the organisms depending on them, and the effect is documented in lakes with no local pollution source whatsoever, hundreds of kilometers from anything. The general point is that remoteness stopped being protection some time ago. A lake reachable only by a day's climb is receiving pollutants from the atmosphere, warming with the climate, and quite possibly holding fish delivered by aircraft. aircraft. Let's talk about spontaneous generation too, because the puzzle of fish appearing in isolated water has a long intellectual history, and it produced some spectacularly wrong answers. For most of recorded history, the dominant explanation was that fish simply formed from mud, from rain, or from the water itself. That was not a folk belief held in ignorance of a better alternative. It was the mainstream position among educated observers, and it applied broadly. Insects were held to arise from decaying matter, mice from stored grain, and eels, whose reproduction was truly mysterious, from various unlikely sources. The eel case is worth noting because it stayed unsolved for an extraordinarily long time. Nobody could find eel eggs or observe them spawning, and explanations proposed across 2 millennia included spontaneous generation from mud and transformation from other animals. The answer, that European eels migrate thousands of kilometers to spawn in the Sargasso Sea, was only established in the 20th century, and their spawning has still never been directly observed in the wild. Spontaneous generation was dismantled experimentally over several centuries, with demonstrations that maggots do not appear in meat protected from flies, and eventually by work establishing that microorganisms do not arise in sterilized, sealed broth. That last set of experiments, conducted in the 19th century, is generally treated as closing the question. The relevance here is that reports of fish in isolated ponds after heavy rain were among the observations sustaining the idea, and they have a mundane explanation. Fish do occasionally fall from the sky, lifted by waterspouts and deposited elsewhere, and such events are documented. More commonly, temporary pools connect briefly to existing water during flooding, or fish have been present all along in a pool that appeared empty. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Most high mountain lakes contained no fish naturally, because there was no route by which fish could reach them. The great majority of mountain lake fish populations exist because people put them there, initially carried up by hand and pack animal from the 19th century onward, and later distributed by aircraft on a scale that reached thousands of lakes. Natural colonization accounts for the rest, principally through connections that existed in the past: glacial meltwater drainages, outburst floods, and stream capture rearranging which basin flows where, along with fish ascending streams that remain passable. The bird explanation, in its adhesion version, has very little evidence behind it. The version involving eggs surviving digestion was demonstrated experimentally in 2020 at extremely low rates, which establishes possibility rather than significance. The ecological consequences were substantial and largely unanticipated, with introduced trout restructuring lakes that had evolved without fish predation and contributing to serious declines in mountain amphibian populations, prompting removal programs that have produced measurable recovery, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. The trout in that impossibly remote lake is not a triumph of nature finding a way. It is more likely the descendant of a fish that arrived by air, in a bucket, dropped from a plane by a government employee who never saw the lake up close.